Hello, my name is Jim Lucey. This is Culture Night, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to be able to speak to you about the life and legacy of Jonathan Swift. Now, in other times, it would have been possible to speak to you and to share a conversation, perhaps, amongst us in a lecture theatre or in a theatre or some pleasant place like that. But tonight, we have to go with the times and realise that we have to speak on the web. So this talk is recorded and being broadcast to you, and I'm happy to, very grateful to you for listening to it, because I think there's a great deal to be said about Jonathan Swift, and something that we could add to the already vast amount of knowledge we have about him by considering his life and legacy in terms of St. Patrick's Hospital. Of course, Swift is a giant figure of Irish life, but really a giant figure of world life. He's a figure not just of literature, but of politics, and of such a scale as is hard to imagine. Even in his own time, he was regarded as being a genius, and perhaps sometimes called the cleverest man in the kingdom. How can it be that this orphaned young man, this man who never knew his father, he died before Jonathan was born, and who was then abandoned in many respects by his mother, raised by nannies and so on, how could he, with very difficult circumstances, turn out to be the giant figure that he became? Many have wondered about this, but it's not easy to answer the question. And certainly a simple dismissal of Swift as being mad or as being in some way curmudgeonly and difficult doesn't help to explain the vast and really fascinating range of cultural and personal aspects of this extraordinary man. Indeed, yes, he had a poor start. He said mockingly, and he tended to use humour hugely cleverly, that his father only lived long enough to keep his mother's good name. But then, subsequently, he was taken to Britain, and then later again sent to Kilkenny College, where he went to school, and later at the age of 14 or so, he went to Trinity College. He was not happy in any of these places, but from there, he went on ultimately to be a member of Queen Anne's cabinet, somebody who sat with the great. Indeed, that became one of his mottos, cum magnus vixisse, I've sat with the great. And he saw his placement as Dean of St. Patrick's as a dismissal. It was in many ways the naughty seat that he was put on for his political agitation, for his integrity really, and for his association with forces which we would now be very proud to identify. The reality is that he was lucky to get the post in many respects, and he recognised that it was a way of getting him out of the seat of power and onto the periphery of the empire. Yes, at the second city of the empire, but nonetheless a minor place to be. During the years that he was in Dublin, he wrestled with this calamitous change in his career path, and he attached himself to a vast number of enterprises for the good of his fellow man. These included the establishment of the Foundling Hospital, now St. James's, of the Meath Hospital, which was his vineyard, but ultimately his great gift, the gift of all his wealth, was to the formation of St. Patrick's Hospital. He never lived to see it, partly because he held out against all the forces around him to insist that it be done right, according to a set of understandings which he described and which we still work by in our charter. I'm giving this talk from my home, and every now and again my dog might come into the picture, so bear with me as we go through it. Jonathan Swift, his portrait is often shown like this, but it makes him look like a rather austere, distant sort of fellow. And indeed, Dr. Johnson and many of his critics following his death were keen to describe him as curmudgeonly, as unpleasant, preoccupied with his bowels, and somehow mad. But nothing could be further from the truth. It was important to dismiss him in this way because he was such a force for good and a potential force for revolution and change. But in fact, Swift in his lifetime was beloved of the people of Dublin and was part of a really interesting set of people who were part of, in many ways, revolutions. We could think of him as being a member of Extinction Revolution or whatever, that kind of almost extreme in many respects, peripheral but revolutionary drive. A forerunner in many ways of Martin Luther King Jr., because he was always non-violent. He used the pen and the power of his wit to rock the empire, and he surely did that. He collected his money not through his writings. We're familiar with Gulliver's Travels and with Three Men in a Tub and his pamphlets, but none of these was ever a source of earning for Swift. Neither did he use his tithes to amass a great wealth. He wasn't some fat cat bishop. No, he invented a form of banking, which was a philanthropic and humanitarian effort we now know as microbanking, a movement across the world which is lauded and which he would be rightly seen as the founder. Microbanking meant giving small amounts of capital to people who were excluded from the market world, who could not be relied on to pay back the money, who were bust. Swift started and gave the capital that it was necessary to start the ventures of thousands of people in Ireland by giving them small amounts of money and requiring them in bonds, which he wrote down and very carefully recorded, and which are a part of the estate of St. Patrick's, to pay back the money with some interest, not punitive interest, but constructive interest. The money ultimately was amassed to a fortune of many thousands of pounds, some say equivalent to about 20 million in today's money. This money, although entailed in various mortgages and estates, was collected after his death by his successors and given to the building of his great ambition, the building of a dedicated home for fools and mad, a proof that no nation needed it so much. Ireland's need for mental health was something he recognised, and he was the beginner of organised mental health care in the country. It's some legacy, and it's worth considering why he did it. People have considered that in very careful and erudite historical ways. The biography or the history of St. Patrick's by Elizabeth Malcolm was funded by the governors of St. Patrick's in their wisdom at the 250th anniversary of his death. And there are really good pieces in that from which I'm drawing. Fools and Mad, Joseph Robbins' book, which was written by the man who really was the forerunner of the group that dismantled the asylums in the 1960s in Ireland. A great man himself. Fools and Mad includes an opening set of chapters which referred necessarily to the beginning of mental health care in Ireland, which is St. Patrick's. But Joseph Robbins is dismissive of Patrick's, regards it as simply a footnote in the history, not part of innovation. Hard to explain how he could do that when St. Patrick's was the first. A more kind and I think sympathetic and wise commentary on St. Patrick's was left to the writings of J.N.P. Moore, the great medical director of the hospital for more than 4 decades in the first half of the 20th century. And his account, written for the 200th anniversary of the hospital, recognises that St. Patrick's is really a culmination of Swift's art and the translation of that art into humanitarian activity, a real synthesis of artistic and humanitarian effort that's worthy of a great man and a great effort. Not something to be dismissed. And indeed, it's not dismissed in Brendan Kelly's magisterial history of Irish mental health care, Hearing Voices. I've drawn from that book as well. I've also drawn from Swift's poetry, just to refer to some of the verses which we use daily in St. Patrick's to remind ourselves of our heritage and I suppose to ground us in his purpose. Swift's poetry is not generally regarded very highly. Certainly it pales in significance compared to the gigantic scale of his writing. But I think it is worthwhile, and its use of rhyme perhaps is overdone, but rhyming, as Heaney says, can help to illuminate. And certainly Swift's poetry, I think, is worth drawing from. So this then is the modern iteration of his legacy on the same site, and it's not perhaps a thing of beauty here, but it's something that does say what it is. St. Patrick's is a university teaching hospital, one that establishes and attempts to maintain the highest standards of mental health care in the country, or indeed in any country. We are about mental health service. We see ourselves as empowering recovery. There is a Swiftian contempt for those who perhaps might puff themselves up. Here in St. Patrick's, it's all about everybody else, and everyone else is in a sense flat, not hierarchical, but committed to the same purpose: recovery of our mental health. Was he mad? Was he mad to do this? Was he not somehow insane to take all this money and insist, and he did insist, that it was given to this purpose? Such was the contempt for mental health and for those afflicted with mental illness by the general populace, and certainly by those powerful, that the only conclusion at the time was that he must have been mad to do this. Certainly it was unprecedented. Madness, though, doesn't explain it. Swift was an enormously significant, genuine, faithful Christian. He was a humanitarian. The last words on his lips were the words of the Our Father. While he was no fanatic, indeed he mocked religion relentlessly. He's one who said that we have just about enough religion to hate each other, and not enough religion to love each other. Nonetheless, his fellowship with humanity was something that surely came out of his faith. And for him, it was important to act on it, to make it real, to manifest it. He could have joined political parties. He would have been a man of huge power had he been willing to distribute his money. But he famously said that party is the madness of the many for the gain of the few. He could have simply lived a high life and drunk his money. And although he did like to live well, his diaries are full of fantastic menus, great meals that he had. He actually lived in a very prudent and abstemious way, believing that he should take exercise, should wash regularly, and should eat as much fruit and vegetables as possible. These were thought to be extraordinary ideas in his time. Now we know him simply to have had the vision of the future that was beyond what even Arthur C. Clarke could have imagined. Surely he was mad, they said. Perhaps because his books were full of a mocking disdain for the follies and the foolishness of our people, and of any people. They can be seen to be almost beyond ridicule, but they're never cruel. There's nothing absolutely without love in his writing, even when he's mocking himself. It's important to recognize that he used humor in a double and triple kind of way. This was a comedian beyond belief. I always like to think that St. Patrick's was founded by a joker. And it's important we remember that he saw the essence, the essential nature of recovery embodied in having a joke. But it was not some ridiculous effort. This effort to deliver mental health care for Ireland was one he stuck at for 23 years, during which time he did not add another word to his great works. Gulliver's Travels was already written. What a book. Three Men in a Tub and others had been classics and successful already at the time. They were on the tables of every powerful man or woman in the world. But Gulliver's Travels is a timeless book. It is our greatest book, I would say. There are some contenders for this in terms of the writers of his time and subsequent writers. What would we say? Would we say that Bram Stoker's writing is the greatest Irish writing, or Joyce's writing? I would say that Swift is Ireland's Cervantes and Gulliver is our Don Quixote. This is a work of such scale that it can be found in every town and every city, anywhere in the world. When my children were young and we'd go on holidays, I used to madden them by playing a joke. We'd go into any town and I'd look for a bookshop and dare them that we would be able to find a copy of Gulliver's Travels on its shelves. It never let me down. It was always there. And Swift's message will always be there. It's in fact a deeply loving message for humanity in all its folly. And that's why he built a home for fools and mad, and proved with one satiric touch, no nation needed it so much. Yes, this is an image of his hospital, an image he never saw. It's a common folly in Dublin that St. Patrick's was built to house his madness, but Swift was not mad, and certainly he was not alive when St. Patrick's was built. The other hospitals I show here, the Rotunda Hospital, Dr. Stevens Hospital, and later Sir Patrick Dunn's Hospital, are part of a movement of which Swift was perhaps the proudest and most notable member. They were a group of 18th century Protestants, ascendancy figures of great humanitarian generosity, who came together to found the hospitals of Dublin, at a time when Dublin's poor and starving were in the streets, when the destitute and the hungry were mounting at numbers not seen anywhere as far as Calcutta, anywhere across the empire. Dublin was literally the filthiest place in the world. And so disease was rife, contagion was rife. Bartholomew Moss, whose hospital opened the same year as our hospital, was a great patriot too, subsequently run out of the country, misunderstood in many respects, because his philanthropy arose from his capacity to generate lotteries and games, and indeed the Gardens of Remembrance now in Parnell Square are on the site of the very games that funded the Rotunda Hospital, named after the theatre which was beside it, which also funded it, part of a great scheme to gather the money necessary to care for the burdened women of Dublin and Ireland, the first maternity hospital in the world. Just as the hospital that Swift gave was a first in terms of its dedication not to women in childbirth, but to men and women in mental distress. Dr. Stevens Hospital, the Yellow Building, now the headquarters of Ireland's Health Service Executive, was built as the first purpose-built general hospital in the country. And later Sir Patrick Dunn's Hospital extended what became known as the Federated Dublin Hospitals, places where a whole movement of healthcare began. The Dublin School of medical treatment became renowned. People like Robert Graves and others described illnesses never described before, using a bedside method known as the Dublin method. This was an apical time described by others, but in the context of huge challenge, it was a necessary effort by these great philanthropists, of which Swift was one, to meet the needs of human beings that were being neglected by the establishment and disregarded by those who had power and money. In contrast to those attitudes, Swift and his confreres dedicated all their wealth and their efforts to trying to help others and to help them in practical ways. What distinguishes Swift's gift was that he saw the necessity of adding to this a standalone, independent, dedicated mental health facility. Such a vision was unprecedented in Ireland. His gift of about £20,000 led to the building of a home for fools and mad. He specified the governance and the organisation of the hospital, its remit, its independence and its culture. This is so much the case that in my 12 years as medical director, I've now retired from that role and am now working clinically on the wards, but I saw again and again the importance of this Swiftian vision. Again and again, efforts to direct Patrick's or to, I would say, misdirect it, were halted by recognition of Swift's vision, which was for a dedicated, independent commitment to mental health care, unbound by politics or pressure or the powerful. It was simply for the Irish people. His concept of medicine was not one that we would find difficult now, but it was revolutionary and has been for 3 centuries. He said the best doctors in the land are Dr. Diet, Dr. Quiet, and Dr. Merryman. Surely diet is coming into its own now. We recognise how important it is to eat well for our mental health. Dr. Quiet has never been more important, and the struggle for mindfulness in a setting in which we can actually be quiet is still a struggle to this day. And Dr. Merryman was part of his awareness that above all, at times of great distress, humour is essential. We can see these as holistic. Modern holistic care wouldn't have a better definition, and yet this is 300 years before the language we use today. He was so far ahead of his time that he was insistent that he was right about the way in which a mental health service should be governed. And it's interesting that the test of time has proved that he was right. And the governance structures we have in Patrick's remain faithful to his original mandate. We, of course, operate within and fully within modern governance systems. And we have managed to obtain full approval of the Irish national governance structure known as the Mental Health Commission. We've done this year on year for nearly a decade. But it's important to recognise that we come from a foundation, a rootedness in a Swiftian vision of clinical governance. This then was part of his legacy. So it's not just bricks and mortar, but also a concept of healthcare. Of course, there are many critics of this, and I'll talk about those in a moment. The wards in St. Patrick's were never satisfactory. There were no windows because the successors of Swift believed that those with mental illness did not feel the cold. Because of the site, Semple, the architect, who was a favourite of Swift's successor and got the job to build the hospital on an inopportune site, a gift of Dr. Stevens, was forced to place the 2 corridors of the hospital for the male and the females parallel to each other, without windows, without proper sanitation. The infection rate of typhus and the like was pretty terrible early on in the first years of St. Patrick's. But his statement about St. Patrick's and his contribution to mental health, his commitment to this agenda, was that a manifestation of his madness? Or perhaps it was a joke? It's been called both of those by his critics. Robbins even recently dismisses it as a curious footnote, something just to be noted in the history of 18th century healthcare. Or, as I would put it to you, it's the enduring legacy of one of Ireland's greatest men. The real manifestation of what it is to be a patriot, a leader, beyond what many centuries produce even once. This was the vision of a great humanitarian, someone who literally put his money where his mouth was. Verses on the death of Dr. Swift were written by himself. He was not modest, and he wrote his epitaph before he died. He gave the little wealth he had to build a house for fools and mad, and showed by one satiric touch no nation wanted it so much. That kingdom he hath left his debtor, I wish it may have a better. The kingdom at the time was riven with strife. The Stuarts were at war. The Battle of Culloden happened the year of Swift's death. Death and destruction and the perils that were described by Hobbes were rife. Life was considered by others as being rightly nasty, brutal, and short. But not for Swift. He saw the commitment to his fellow man as part of his philosophy, and he was part of a movement of philosophers who justified this as saying it was the only purpose of our mankind, of our living, to contribute to each other. That a simple view of life, that it was just about the gain for ourselves and the experience of it as quickly as possible, was not sufficient. Generosity, therefore, was beyond belief. Of all the charities, this is the most disinterested, his friend Alexander Pope said. By this he meant he had nothing to gain. Erecting a hospital for the unhappy, note the holistic view of mental illness, is an act truly worthy of so great a man. for which the future age must honour and revere the memory. The Lord Mayor of London recognised it, as well he might. Swift had been a chaplain in Bedlam Hospital, an earlier version of a care arrangement for the mentally ill. But unlike Patrick's, Bedlam was a circus. It cared in certain senses, but it's funded itself by allowing people to come and abuse the mentally ill, to mock them, to throw fruit at them. Swift had been chaplain to this appalling place, and he knew that we needed something quite different. In this sense, his effort was truly innovative as well as generous. Nothing is so hard for those who abound in riches as to conceive how others can be in want. So many of his aphorisms tell us about his real self, and they do so concealing and hiding his efforts. But he was very clear that great wealth can often obscure you from doing the right thing. Now, of course, there are hugely important examples of philanthropists, of people who have given to mental health, indeed to general health around the world. But it's interesting that since Swift gave his gift, no rich man or woman in Ireland has ever given anything near to mental health. And of all the things we've tried to do in St. Patrick's, in rejuvenating it, in restoring it, reforming it, and making it fit for modern 21st century Ireland, the one thing we failed to do is to gather the momentum of those with the money to actually make mental health work. We've done it by efforts around and about, supported by people's cash and their generosity in small ways, but none of the great philanthropists have moved to match Swift. And it's worth thinking about that. It places his gift at such a scale throughout time, throughout the world, and in our present time. It's unparalleled. He wrote about this in such way as to mock those who should have known better. He used satire, his famous modest proposal, where he opposed the corruption of the Irish economy through Wood's pence by suggesting that we should better actually float the economy by selling our children, not live, of course, but roasted on sticks with fricassee and sauce placed on them, because he believed the Americans would particularly like that. The joke was so searing and so powerful, it was not lost on the Irish people, who roared at it, who bought copies of it in their thousands. The printer of Draper's letter was arrested, but Swift, although everyone knew who wrote it, dodged them. We have the desk in which he wrote it. I'll show it to you in a moment. But the point about it was that he absolutely was able to get past the prevailing dominance of the governments and the media, and through his satire make his point. And Wood's pence did not succeed, and he saved the Ireland from a huge tyranny, which no one else could have. His portraits are many, and we have a number of them in the hospital, and they are, I suppose, not terribly informative about his real appearance. But this one is a good one, collected by Dr. Leeper, Moore's predecessor, and the man who brought the hospital in many respects from the 18th century into modern times. Leeper founded the first nursing school, introduced wider diet. Interestingly, in terms of Swift's love of fruit, Leeper built the first greenhouses and put gooseberries on the diet of the patients. This is the desk in the same room, the boardroom of St. Patrick's, which Swift's writings are said to have taken place. We know this is genuinely his desk. The provenance of it is unarguable. And it's a desk originally French, 1700s. And if you look at the cornices at the top, you may not be aware, but they are actually hollow. They slide, and inside them you can secrete papers. In behind those drawers, there are further secret cabinets. This was a desk to elude the search of the army, of the police, who came looking for Swift after his writings were considered seditious. Here he could prepare his piercing arguments, his multiple letters, and know that they wouldn't be found. or at least hope that they would elude finding a little bit longer. It's a desk of great intrigue as well as beauty, and I like to imagine him there, just as I do like to imagine his spirit around the wards and the walls of St. Patrick's. Of course, as I said, he was never there, but his image is throughout the hospital. In appropriate ways, we've tried to remember him. Not because he would have liked to have been puffed up. He mocked those people who gave their names to things. The hospital was known as Swift's Hospital for about 100 years, but because we want to go back to the vision he had, and we want to translate that into a vision we need for today. How do you do that, he said? Well, you do it using another of his mottos, the motto Festina Lente, hasten slowly, rebuild slowly. It's an image we repeat, and I repeat to my patients every day. Take your time. Recovery will come, but slowly, that's okay. We will be making haste if we take it slowly. But of course, like everything Swift wrote, and all the memories we have around the hospital, it's a hidden memory with a hidden message. It's like opening up some kind of talisman. If you look inside it, you find more about Swift that he's hidden. Swift was someone that Joyce loved, and Joyce purposely wrote his writing, copying this aspect of Swiftiana. Inside everything, there was another meaning and another meaning. And so his choice of the word, or the motto, Festina Lente, was not just a wise thing for a person to recommend. Anybody embarking on a difficult pursuit is going to have to give it time. 23 years he spent working to build St. Patrick's. But it's also a hidden message about himself. Swift loved to play with his name. Swift, go quickly. Festina, make haste. It's the same word. And so what he's really saying is, make my vision patiently, slowly. And if you must do so, be confident that it will take time. He called himself speedy, presto, festina. And we have in his letters, often very choice letters he wrote to his lovers. He had two, by the way, it said. Often references with this delightful pun imprinted in them. There can be no doubt that Festina Lente is what we've had to do with mental health in Ireland, and we're still far behind where we need to get as a nation in terms of the care for those of our people who have mental health difficulty. But that approach is still the right one, determined to be Festina but Lente. He also understood that we have to sit with power. I'm perhaps rather critical of the philanthropists who've been so absent in our subsequent funding of mental health care in Ireland, or indeed of the wider health care. But Swift would be cautious about that. He would say you have to sit with these people. In fact, that was his motto, cum magnus vixisse, loosely translated as being, I've sat with the great. He may not like them, he may be critical of them, but he sits with them. Why? Because he realized he was on a par with those people. And in fact, to be with power was essential if we were going to direct it towards the humanitarian causes he so valued. Gulliver is not just a commentary on human nature as a whole, it's a commentary on the political basis of our societies and the follies of those who are great. In this motto, of course, he, like so many of his time, but particularly himself, was steeped in antiquity and an awareness of great literature and knowledge, and particularly the knowledge of the Renaissance. Swift was not a man who sat easily with the Enlightenment, that era of the last several hundred years, in which we've come to see empirical knowledge as being paramount, research and the source of knowledge through experiment was just emerging as Swift was around. And Swift looked at his predecessor, a great in the pantheon of learned people, Erasmus, also a priest, for a better way. Erasmus is the father of the via media, the middle way, the sense of seeing, in this case, between religion or faith and science or fact. It was not for him to use the parody of extremism without some purpose. He used these parodies for the purpose of shocking us into the folly of extremism, and in fact, into recognizing the importance of the middle way, of seeing the importance of data. No, St. Patrick's has no chapel in it. It was built without the grandiose attempts to get the prayerful and the good into its coffers, the way that Bartholomew's Moss built the chapel of the Rotunda. It specified in an immensely modern and egalitarian way, a non-sectarian way, and it was open to every faith and every religion. This was beyond generous in his time. To think of this and to translate into now is hard to imagine, but it's important he excluded no one. He certainly didn't exclude the papists from the beneficence of his care. Anyone who reads Erasmus, and there's so much to read there, will find in it roots of much of Swift's thinking. It's the irrationality that is so rational about Jonathan Swift. But it's not foolish to make mental health our priority. And the messages and the memories and the rootedness of Swift in our building, in our service, in what we do, makes this point every day. Swift wanted us to mind ourselves, and we still need to do that. And we can't rely on the great and the good, the powerful, or the state to do it for us. We need to mind our selfies, and we still need to do it just as he knew 300 years ago. Many people have come along and worked in this great place, and they are part of his legacy because they couldn't have come if he hadn't been there. I like to think of Dr. Robert Emmett, the father of the Patriot, who became its first medical director or hospital physician, a great governor. In fact, rather tragically, when his son was hanged, the judge who handed down the sentence added for insult to his condemnation of Emmett, the junior, that Emmett Robert should have known better, given that his father was a doctor. I suppose stigma takes many forms. And of course, there are many other famous doctors who've worked in St. Patrick's, along with so many other people who are part of the clinical care, nurses, psychologists, social workers, and a whole range of the clinical team, as we in a modern sense see it. Some great things have happened that happened because Patrick's is the way it is. As an example, I like to give the example of the first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous that happened in Patrick's just a little over 50 years ago. The first meeting in Europe to happen in Patrick's because of its open nature, its non-sectarian nature, its willingness to go beyond in a way that Swift would have admired. Of course, Dr. Emmett wasn't the only doctor. Subsequently, there was the much, in fact, more famous doctor, Dr. Stoker, who was Sir Thornley Stoker. Thornley Stoker was the brother of Bram Stoker, and Bram Stoker is the author of the other book of, I suppose, one of the other books of an Irishman that's in every bookshop in the world, Dracula. This lovely letter from Dr. Dennis Eustace, one of our great friends of the family of the Highfield Hospital, and one of the family of the tradition of the Quakers, which were so dedicated to mental health for centuries in Ireland, is taken from the Irish Times in October of 2012. Sir, it says, as the celebrations to mark the centenary of Bram Stoker's death continue, it seems a pity that there has been practically no mention whatsoever of his brother, Sir Thornley Stoker, who passed away 6 weeks after Bram. Sir Thornley was a remarkable man by any standards who would envy for his incredible achievements. A very gifted surgeon, he developed an expertise in abdominal and neurosurgery, Indeed, in 1878 he pioneered the art of the hysterectomy. He was also the first surgeon in Ireland to successfully perform brain surgery by a method known as trephining. Together with his brother-in-law, Sir William Thompson, he performed Ireland's first prostatectomy. Sir Thornley was Professor of Anatomy and more latterly President of the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. He was visiting surgeon and governor to Swift's Hospital, as it was known, St Patrick's Hospital as it is now. In the Richmond Hospital, he drew up plans for the new building previously known as the House of Industry. There he was responsible for setting up Ireland's first school of nursing. He was awarded a knighthood in 1895 and a baronetcy in 1911. His interests outside medicine were wide. He had a keen interest in art and was a senior figure in the Royal Hibernian Academy. He was also governor of the National Gallery of Ireland. His magnificent house in Ely Place had wonderful works of art, and many guests would marvel at its antiquities. In fact, Sir Thornley was ultimately responsible for introducing high-end furniture to doctors' waiting rooms, such claim. Well, he goes on to say that Sir Thornley would have advised his brother Bram on matters regarding venous and arterial venesection. One wonders, would the masterpiece of Dracula have been conceived at all if it hadn't have been for his brother's influence? Bram, it said, was a sickly child, and his brother, who was already a doctor, used to use venesection or bloodletting to relieve his fevers. I put this up because it's one of many tangential ways in which we can see that Swift's legacy went on in each century to be a vibrant part and a continuing contributory part of Irish culture. We mightn't see this man as an Irishman, but he clearly was. Here, I think Bela Lugosi taking on the role. A more perhaps attractive and easy image is to be had of modern St Patrick's, which has attempted to capture Swift's vision to emphasize the importance of recovery, certainly to see the best clinicians in the land as being rooted in better diet, better quiet, better merriment, but also better human rights. Of all things, Swift's commitment was humanitarian. It was for service of his fellow man. The modern understanding of that is a rights-based vision of human beings' existence. It's absolutely right that Swift's Hospital has embedded itself in that culture and continues to be the leading voice for a human rights approach to mental health care. We've said this in every turn, in every way we can. We've reached out to form new clinics around the country, to form a dedicated children's unit. We've spoken up for the rights of children to be incorporated in our constitution. And we continue to speak up in advocacy daily for those who are most afflicted and still most marginalised, those with mental illness and mental health distress and difficulty. We continue to feel that mental health is Ireland's greatest unmet need, and in many respects, one of the largest unmet needs around the world. By incorporating the ideas and the spirit and the dedication of Swift, we've managed to translate this into a whole series of ways. Messages that can be translated, yes, into the older buildings, but also into the newer shapes and media that make up modern healthcare. Our wards are named after the characters of his life. Our clinics are named after himself and carry on in a sense of his ownership. Our information centres and our capacity to use the web and modern social media are all translations very much of Swift's use of humour and of polemic and of journalism and of media to get across the image and the vision of healthcare and the necessity of getting past the great and the good who might otherwise ignore this hugely important agenda. So now St Patrick's is a really vibrant place with huge amounts of activity and space and colour, which belie its original 18th century fabric. Today, much of this is being reconfigured as a result of the changes brought about by the COVID pandemic. But still, we're out there and making use of social media and making use of modern technologies such as this one to reach those who need mental health care in every way we can. It's important that we, as the institution of mental health care, need to move to where people are. Community mental health care is about discovering people where their distress is and returning them to where their life can be. It's about being in the community where you live, work and love again. And it's always been that vision that has been Swift's vision. He said for us that vision was the art of seeing what is invisible to others. And the vision of this recovery, of this human rights-based nature of mental health treatment, was something that was impossible for his peers to understand, and still remains impossible for many to believe in. It's still something we need to shout for and insist that those who are in power understand. At this time of COVID, when the rise in mental health and common health difficulties is so striking, nearly a doubling of the issues of depression, anxiety disorder, alcoholism, that we need to actually reinvigorate our understanding, recapture this vision, and see what is currently invisible as being the visible recovery of people in this country from this terrible difficulty we're in. We can do this if we capture all the modern means, modern science, modern therapy, the best of research and academia, and capture it and make it available to people in an egalitarian way. I'd encourage you all to look at our website, see its research, see its literature, see its patient testimony, its advocacy for what we do and try to do so well. See how far still it falls short of Swift's full vision, and see how we are still trying to make that vision fulfilled, hastening, but doing so slowly and continually. We try and describe this in many ways, and certainly Swift's original tradition of writing books has become something that now is commonplace in our hospital. In fact, I think nearly everybody writes a book in Patrick's at this stage. Here are some that I'd recommend, but there are many others, and I'd encourage you to go on to our website and embrace and engage with the bibliography, the literature, and the knowledge base that can be so helpful to us all. So often when I see people in distress, the first distress they have in mental health sometimes, they respond by saying to me that they don't know what's happening to them. We need to have a place, a commitment, an energy around making that experience understandable. Letting everyone know the experience of mental health distress is not something that's exclusive to those who are foolish and mad, but something that is universal to our humanity, and something that actually is an episode in our life which can come to an end and be restored with recovery. St. Patrick's is Ireland's largest independent not-for-profit mental health service, and it aspires to be recognised as a leader in the provision of healthcare of quality, of mental health care, of awareness and rights, of protection of the rights and the integrity of those who are experiencing mental health difficulties and the rights of those who care for them. It's now known as St. Patrick's Mental Health Service, and through its association with Trinity College and its continuing interpretation of Swift's vision, it's driven by the same energy and vision that he determined from the very first. It remains his legacy and his gift to Ireland, and it's one that I'm very happy to have shared with you. Thank you for listening to me.